There is a moment in every human life when something inside you begins to shift, quietly, invisibly, but undeniably. You start noticing that what once felt ordinary now feels misaligned. People misunderstand you without reason. Doors close without explanation. And yet, deeper than confusion, there is a strange sense of purpose rising within you, as if life itself is preparing you for something you cannot yet name. One of the earliest and most disorienting signs of a deeply transformative inner calling is a form of isolation that cannot be easily explained by external circumstances. It is not the kind of loneliness that comes from simply being physically alone, nor is it the temporary solitude that people choose for rest or reflection. It is something subtler, something that slowly grows even when life appears normal on the surface. You may find yourself sitting among people, participating in conversations, fulfilling social expectations, and yet still feeling as though a part of you is slightly removed from everything happening around you. It is not that you dislike people or reject connection, but rather that connection itself begins to feel different, less satisfying, less complete, as if something essential is missing from most interactions. This experience often begins quietly. At first, it is easy to ignore. You might assume it is just a phase, a temporary emotional fluctuation, or even the result of stress or overthinking. But over time, the pattern becomes more consistent. Conversations that once felt engaging start to feel repetitive. Social gatherings that once brought comfort begin to feel performative. Even relationships that are stable and familiar start to feel like they exist on a surface level, touching only the outer layer of your awareness without reaching the deeper parts of who you are becoming. There is a growing sense that you are observing life more than fully participating in it, as if you are both inside and slightly outside your own experiences. What makes this isolation particularly complex is that it does not always come with sadness. In fact, there are moments when it feels neutral, even calm. You may find yourself appreciating the silence, valuing the distance, and recognizing that being alone allows you to hear your own thoughts more clearly. But beneath that calm surface, there is often an unspoken tension, a quiet awareness that something fundamental has shifted in the way you relate to the world. You are no longer fully absorbed by external validation, nor are you completely dependent on social reinforcement to understand your place in life. Instead, you begin to rely more on internal perception, even when it feels unfamiliar or uncertain. This type of isolation often emerges when a person begins to outgrow the environments they once belonged to. It is not necessarily that those environments are wrong or harmful, but that they no longer match the level of internal transformation taking place. You may find that your interests change in ways others around you do not share. Your questions become deeper, more reflective, less concerned with surface outcomes, and more focused on meaning, purpose, and direction. As this shift happens, natural emotional distance forms, not because of rejection, but because of divergence in inner development. There is also a psychological aspect to this experience that is often misunderstood. When a person begins to perceive reality differently, they also begin to interpret social dynamics differently. What once felt meaningful in group settings may start to feel repetitive or predictable. Emotional exchanges may feel less spontaneous and more conditioned by habit. You begin to notice patterns in human behavior that others may not consciously observe, and this awareness can create a subtle sense of separation. It is not superiority, nor is it detachment by choice, but rather heightened perception that changes how ordinary interactions are experienced internally. Over time, this isolation can feel like a quiet filtering process. Certain relationships naturally fade, not through conflict, but through distance that grows without explanation. New connections may form, but they often carry a different quality, fewer in number, but deeper in resonance. You may find yourself valuing authenticity over frequency, depth over comfort, and silence over unnecessary engagement. Even so, there remains a persistent feeling that very few people truly understand the internal world you are navigating, not because you are hidden, but because what you are experiencing does not easily translate into ordinary language or shared emotional reference points. There is a kind of restlessness that does not come from anxiety in the ordinary sense, nor from the pressure of external demands alone. It is deeper, more persistent, and strangely independent of circumstances. Even when life appears stable on the outside, when responsibilities are managed and basic needs are met, something within continues to move, to question, to resist stillness. It is not chaos, but it is not peace either. It is a constant internal motion, as if your awareness refuses to settle into anything that feels final or complete. This restlessness often begins as a subtle discomfort with routine. At first, you may not even recognize it as anything significant. You fulfill your daily obligations, engage in familiar patterns, and participate in the structure of ordinary life. Yet, a quiet dissatisfaction lingers beneath it all. It is not always emotional pain, but rather a sense that what you are experiencing is not the full version of what life could be. You may find yourself questioning choices that others seem completely comfortable with, not because those choices are wrong, but because they feel too small for something inside you that has not yet found expression. Over time, this inner movement becomes more noticeable. You may shift interests frequently, not out of indecision, but out of a need to explore something that feels more aligned with an undefined internal standard. What once inspired you may lose its intensity quickly, and what once felt meaningful may begin to feel repetitive or insufficient. This is not a sign of instability, but rather a reflection of an evolving internal framework that is constantly seeking expansion. The mind begins to reject stagnation even in its most comfortable forms, and the emotional system becomes less tolerant of anything that feels like limitation or repetition without growth. What makes this restlessness particularly complex is that it does not always lead to clear answers. Instead of resolution, it often leads to deeper questioning. Instead of satisfaction, it creates further exploration. You may move from one idea to another, from one goal to the next, not because you are lost, but because each step reveals that there is still more beneath the surface. This can create a paradoxical experience where progress exists externally, but internally there is always a sense of continuation rather than completion. You are never fully finished with becoming. There is also a psychological intensity to this state that affects how you relate to time and direction. The present moment rarely feels sufficient on its own. There is always a sense that something is ahead, something not yet accessed, something that requires movement. Even rest can feel temporary rather than permanent. When you pause, you do not feel stillness in the complete sense. Instead, you feel anticipation, as if stillness itself is only a pause before the next phase of inner development. This creates an unusual relationship with patience, where waiting is not passive but charged with internal activity. This kind of restlessness often isolates individuals in a subtle way, not because they are disconnected from others, but because their internal rhythm does not always align with external pace. While many people find comfort in repetition and predictability, this inner state resists becoming fully contained within those structures. There is always a part of awareness scanning for depth, meaning, or transformation, even in simple experiences. Ordinary moments are no longer just ordinary. They are constantly being evaluated for their potential to reveal something deeper. At times, this internal pressure can feel like dissatisfaction with life itself, but beneath that surface interpretation lies something more precise. It is not rejection of life, but rejection of limitation. It is not inability to appreciate what exists, but inability to remain confined to what already exists without exploring what lies beyond it. This creates a continuous tension between acceptance and expansion, between presence and becoming, where neither state fully cancels the other. There is a particular kind of frustration that does not come from being ignored, but from being heard incorrectly. You speak with clarity, you choose your words with intention, and you often express yourself with sincerity, yet what returns to you is not always what you meant to convey. People interpret your actions through filters that belong to their own experiences, fears, assumptions, and emotional conditioning. Over time, you begin to notice a pattern that feels both confusing and repetitive. The more honest and direct you are, the more distorted the reflection of your intentions becomes in the perception of others. This experience is not always immediate. In the beginning, you may assume it is a misunderstanding that can be corrected through better explanation. You may try to rephrase your thoughts, adjust your tone, or soften your delivery in an attempt to make your inner truth more accessible. Yet even with these adjustments, something essential still gets lost in translation. The issue is rarely about language alone. It is about the gap between your internal world and the interpretive frameworks people use to understand that world. Every person listens through the lens of their own history, and that lens often reshapes what they receive without them even realizing it. As this pattern continues, a deeper awareness begins to form. You start to recognize that honesty does not guarantee clarity in the eyes of others. In fact, raw honesty can sometimes create discomfort because it does not always align with what people expect or prefer to hear. When your truth challenges assumptions, it can be reshaped unconsciously by others into something more familiar or easier to process. This is where misunderstanding becomes not just a communication issue, but a psychological one. People do not always receive you as you are. They receive a version of you that has been adjusted to fit their internal narrative. There is also a subtle emotional burden that comes with this repeated misalignment. You begin to question whether expressing yourself fully is worth the confusion it creates. Not because you are uncertain about your truth, but because you become aware that truth alone does not guarantee recognition. This can lead to moments of hesitation where you carefully weigh how much of yourself should be shared in any given situation, not out of fear of being wrong, but out of awareness that being right in your own understanding does not prevent others from interpreting you differently. Over time, this experience shapes the way you communicate. You may become more precise, more reflective, or even more restrained in how you express certain ideas. Not because your authenticity diminishes, but because you begin to understand that communication is not only about expression, but also about translation. You realize that what you say exists in two spaces simultaneously, your intention and the receiver's interpretation, and those two spaces do not always overlap. This creates a continuous negotiation between being fully transparent and being understood in practical terms. What makes this experience particularly complex is that it does not stem from deception or conflict. It arises even in moments of sincerity, even in relationships where there is trust or goodwill. You may find that even those closest to you occasionally misinterpret your tone, your intentions, or your emotional state. This reinforces a quiet realization that misunderstanding is not an exception in human interaction, but a recurring condition of it. It is not always personal, yet it often feels personal because it involves something as intimate as your inner truth. There is also a deeper psychological layer to this pattern. As awareness grows, you begin to see how perception is shaped more by internal assumptions than external reality. People often hear what aligns with their expectations rather than what is actually being said. This creates a constant filtering process where meaning is reconstructed internally rather than received directly. In such a landscape, even the most honest communication can become fragmented, reshaped, or partially lost in translation without intentional distortion from either side. There is a strange and often confusing pattern that emerges around certain individuals where the responses they receive from others are rarely neutral. Instead of being met with indifference or balanced reception, they tend to evoke strong reactions that fall into two very distinct directions. Some people feel a deep sense of connection, trust, or admiration toward them almost immediately, while others experience discomfort, resistance, or even unexplained opposition without a clear reason. This polarization is not always related to what is said or done externally, but rather something that is felt internally by others in response to presence alone. At first, this pattern can feel random. You may encounter people who support you with unusual intensity, who defend your presence even when it is not required, who remain loyal through situations that would normally weaken relationships. These individuals often perceive something in you that resonates beyond surface interaction. They may not fully articulate what draws them in, but their response is consistent and emotionally anchored. It feels as though your presence activates something within them that aligns with trust, recognition, or inspiration, even if they cannot fully explain it themselves. At the same time, you may notice another pattern developing in parallel. There are individuals who seem to react to you with subtle resistance, skepticism, or discomfort, sometimes without any direct interaction that would justify such a response. This opposition is not always expressed openly or aggressively. In many cases, it manifests as distance, misunderstanding, or quiet dismissal. What is particularly perplexing is that it often arises without conflict, without disagreement, and without any clear cause. It simply exists as an undercurrent in certain interactions. As time passes, this dual response begins to form a recognizable pattern. Your presence does not go unnoticed, but it also does not remain neutral. It seems to create movement in others, either drawing them closer or pushing them away. This dynamic can feel disorienting because it removes the middle ground that most people rely on in social experiences. Instead of gradual familiarity or neutral coexistence, interactions tend to develop intensity in one direction or another. You are either deeply acknowledged or quietly resisted, and rarely does the experience remain emotionally flat. Psychologically, this phenomenon is often linked to perception rather than intention. People interpret others through internal frameworks shaped by their experiences, beliefs, insecurities, and emotional history. When someone carries a strong sense of presence, clarity, or authenticity, it can act as a form of contrast that highlights unresolved aspects within others. For some, this contrast creates admiration and attraction as they recognize qualities they value or aspire to develop. For others, it creates discomfort as it unintentionally reflects areas they may avoid confronting within themselves. This is why the reactions you receive are not always proportional to your behavior. You may act with consistency, respect, and neutrality, yet still encounter opposing responses that seem disproportionate. The key lies not in what you are doing, but in what you are representing to the perception of others. Presence alone can become a catalyst for emotional interpretation, and emotional interpretation often operates independently of logic or objective assessment. Over time, this dynamic can shape how you experience relationships and social environments. You may begin to notice that certain connections feel effortless and deeply aligned, while others require constant adjustment or remain subtly tense without resolution. This contrast can create a heightened awareness of relational energy, where you start to recognize that not all connections are built on the same emotional foundation. Some are rooted in resonance, while others are influenced by internal resistance that has little to do with you directly. There is also a deeper layer to this experience that involves identity perception. As people project their interpretations onto you, different versions of who you are begin to exist in the minds of others. To some, you may represent strength, clarity, or inspiration. To others, you may unintentionally represent challenge, uncertainty, or emotional disruption. These projections are not fixed or objective, but they influence how interactions unfold over time, reinforcing either alignment or distance depending on the internal state of the observer. There is a certain type of life experience where difficulties do not appear as isolated incidents, but rather as connected patterns that seem to carry a hidden structure. Instead of challenges arriving randomly and fading away without leaving meaning behind, they often repeat in different forms as if life is circling around specific lessons that refuse to be ignored. These struggles do not always feel like punishment, and they do not always feel like coincidence either. They carry a weight of significance that is difficult to explain logically, yet impossible to dismiss emotionally. Over time, you begin to sense that what you are facing is not simply happening to you, but is actively shaping something within you. At first, you may interpret these challenges in the same way most people do, as obstacles that interrupt progress or create discomfort in otherwise stable plans. You try to solve them, avoid them, or move past them as quickly as possible, assuming that resolution is the natural goal of every difficulty. But what becomes increasingly noticeable is that resolution alone does not seem to end the cycle. A similar situation returns in a different form, often with slightly different details but carrying the same emotional lesson. This repetition begins to shift your perception from seeing problems as isolated events to recognizing them as part of a larger developmental pattern. As this pattern continues, there is often a gradual change in how you interpret hardship itself. You start to notice that certain experiences seem designed to develop internal qualities rather than simply disrupt external circumstances. Situations that require patience begin to develop emotional endurance. Situations that involve misunderstanding begin to develop clarity in self-perception. Situations that involve loss or change begin to expand your capacity for adaptation. The difficulty is no longer just something to escape, but something that quietly contributes to a deeper internal structure, even when it feels uncomfortable in the moment. What makes this experience particularly complex is that it does not follow a predictable emotional timeline. Growth does not always feel like progress while it is happening. In fact, many of the most significant internal shifts occur during periods that feel confusing, heavy, or directionless. You may not recognize the value of an experience while you are inside it, because the meaning is often only visible after distance has been created. Yet even without immediate understanding, there is often a subtle awareness that these experiences are not empty. They carry a kind of internal weight that suggests development is occurring beneath the surface, even when external results are not yet visible. There is also a psychological dimension to this pattern that influences how you relate to endurance itself. Over time, you begin to develop a different relationship with difficulty, one that is less reactive and more observational. Instead of immediately resisting or emotionally collapsing under pressure, there is a growing capacity to observe what is happening without completely identifying with it. This does not remove pain or challenge, but it changes how deeply it defines your sense of self. You begin to separate the experience of difficulty from the totality of who you are, which allows space for reflection even in intense moments. Another aspect of this pattern is the gradual realization that certain life lessons cannot be bypassed. No matter how much you attempt to avoid them, they reappear in different forms until they are fully understood at an internal level. This creates a sense that life is not simply random, but selectively repetitive, focusing attention on specific areas of development. The repetition is not identical in appearance, but consistent in emotional theme. It may involve trust, boundaries, identity, resilience, or direction, yet the underlying lesson remains stable until it is integrated rather than avoided. Over time, this experience reshapes your understanding of progress itself. Progress is no longer defined only by external achievement or visible success, but also by internal transformation that occurs through sustained engagement with difficulty. You begin to recognize that certain forms of growth cannot be rushed, delegated, or avoided. They require direct experience, emotional processing, and repeated encounters with similar challenges until something fundamental shifts within perception. The struggle, in this sense, becomes less of an interruption and more of a continuous process of refinement that operates quietly beneath the surface of daily life. There is a form of inner responsibility that does not originate from external demands, social expectations, or clearly defined obligations. It is not something assigned to you by circumstance, nor is it imposed through authority or tradition. Instead, it emerges from within as a quiet but persistent awareness that your presence carries weight beyond ordinary participation in life. This sense of responsibility is often difficult to articulate because it does not always align with measurable roles or visible duties. It exists more as an internal orientation, a steady pull towards something meaningful that you cannot fully define but also cannot ignore. At the surface level, life may appear structured in the same way it does for others. You engage in daily routines, respond to responsibilities that are shared by everyone, and fulfill the expected roles within your environment. However, beneath that shared structure, there is an additional layer of awareness that feels uniquely personal. It is as if your attention is constantly being drawn toward questions that extend beyond immediate needs. Questions about direction, impact, truth, and meaning begin to surface even in ordinary moments, creating a sense that your experience of life is not meant to remain entirely contained within routine existence. This internal sense of responsibility does not always feel comforting. In fact, there are moments when it creates pressure, not because of external demands, but because of internal expectation. You may feel a continuous pull toward improvement, understanding, or contribution, even when there is no clear instruction on what exactly should be done. This creates a unique form of tension where stillness does not feel entirely complete and action does not always feel fully defined. It is not dissatisfaction with life itself, but rather a sense that life is asking something from you that has not yet been fully revealed. Over time, this awareness begins to influence how you interpret your own choices. Decisions are no longer evaluated only by immediate outcomes or personal convenience. There is an additional layer of reflection that considers whether a choice aligns with something deeper within you. Even in simple decisions, there can be a subtle awareness of consequence that extends beyond the present moment. This does not always lead to clarity, but it does create a heightened sense of attentiveness to direction and intention. What makes this experience particularly complex is that the responsibility you feel is not always connected to recognition or validation. It often exists independently of whether others acknowledge it or understand it. In many cases, it becomes stronger in environments where external confirmation is absent. This can create a sense of internal solitude, where the direction you feel compelled toward is not always reinforced by your surroundings. Instead, it is sustained by an internal certainty that does not require external agreement in order to remain active. There is also a psychological depth to this experience that influences how you relate to purpose itself. Purpose is no longer viewed as a single destination or clearly defined achievement, but as an ongoing process of alignment. Rather than waiting for a definitive moment of clarity, you begin to experience purpose as something that unfolds gradually through engagement, reflection, and responsibility toward what feels meaningful in the present. This shifts the focus from seeking external validation of direction to developing internal consistency in how you respond to life. As this awareness deepens, there is often a growing sensitivity to the impact of actions, words, and presence. You begin to recognize that influence does not always come from position or authority, but from subtle interactions and consistent behavior. Even without intention, your presence may affect others in ways that extend beyond immediate observation. This creates a sense of accountability that is not driven by fear of consequence, but by recognition of interconnectedness between personal actions and broader outcomes. This internal responsibility also reshapes how you experience silence and reflection. Moments of solitude are no longer empty or passive, but active spaces where awareness continues to process direction and meaning. In these moments, there is often a sense of ongoing internal dialogue, where questions about alignment and contribution continue to surface without resolution. Rather than seeking immediate answers, there is a gradual acceptance that understanding develops through continued engagement rather than fixed conclusions. There are experiences in human life that cannot be reduced to simple explanations or convenient categories. They do not always announce themselves clearly, nor do they follow patterns that are easy to predict. Instead, they unfold slowly, shaping perception, refining awareness, and altering the way a person relates to themselves and the world around them. What appears at first as confusion, isolation, or resistance often reveals itself over time as part of a deeper process of inner formation that cannot be rushed or fully controlled. When a person begins to recognize these patterns within their own life, something subtle begins to shift. Struggles that once felt meaningless begin to carry structure. Isolation that once felt like rejection begins to feel like recalibration. Misunderstanding that once felt like failure begins to reveal the limits of perception itself. Even internal restlessness, which once seemed like instability, begins to feel like movement towards something not yet fully visible. The same experiences do not necessarily change in form, but they begin to change in interpretation, and that shift in interpretation becomes the beginning of deeper awareness. This process does not remove difficulty. It does not eliminate uncertainty or simplify complexity. Instead, it changes the relationship a person has with those experiences. What once felt like random suffering begins to feel like a continuous unfolding of internal development. What once felt like contradiction begins to feel like tension that carries direction. In this space, life is no longer experienced as a series of disconnected events, but as a layered process where each experience contributes to something that is still forming. There is also a quiet realization that emerges through this journey, a recognition that not everything meaningful is immediately understood while it is happening. Some experiences only reveal their significance in reflection, after distance has been created, after emotional intensity has softened, and after perspective has expanded. This delayed understanding does not diminish the value of the experience. Instead, it reinforces the idea that growth often operates beneath immediate awareness, shaping perception long before it becomes visible in clarity. At a deeper level, this awareness brings a shift in how a person relates to identity itself. Instead of seeing oneself as fixed or fully defined, there is a growing recognition that identity is continuously shaped through experience, response, and interpretation. What a person is becoming is not always fully accessible in the present moment, yet it is constantly influenced by how they engage with what they are going through. In this sense, life becomes less about arriving at a final definition and more about remaining present within an ongoing process of becoming. And within that process, even uncertainty begins to lose its threatening quality. It becomes part of the structure rather than an interruption of it. What remains is a deeper form of awareness that does not rely on immediate resolution, but continues to observe, adapt, and unfold through every stage of experience.